Hello and welcome to the Pink Pineapple Podcast, where we peel back femtech and take a bite out of more than just the juicy bits.
I'm Claudia, and I'm Emma's partner in Pineapple for this adventure.
And I'm Emma. Together, we're exploring women's health across the full timeline, from first periods to menopause and everything in between.
Each week, we'll dive into the stories, science, and software shaping the future of women's health, from hormones to hardware, fertility to femtech founders.
Think of us as your slightly nosy best friends who just happen to be doctors with a healthy curiosity for innovation.
We'll be chatting to clinicians, creators, and changemakers, and yes, asking the questions you actually want answered.
So whether you're out for a walk, cooking dinner, or hiding from your to-do list, join us as we get curious, clinical, and occasionally controversial.
This is the Pink Pineapple Podcast,
where women's health meets what's next. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Pink Pineapple Podcast. This week, we have Molly Jowsey from Revela. She is the co-founder and an engineer by background, and we are very much looking forward to getting into what Revela is and what she's been working on. Claudia, you've also got another guest. I'm very intrigued this week as I know absolutely nothing about what you have done to this pineapple.
Well, thank you for joining us, Molly. And I'm going to start with an apology that there are no pineapples in Cyprus at this time of year. However, because I'm very resourceful, what I've brought you today is a beet for endometriosis. I honestly stood there in the fruit and vegetable aisle and I was like, there is no pineapple. What on earth am I going to do? So ChatGPT to the rescue. What fruit or vegetable can I use in the context of endometriosis? And there it is. Ladies and gentlemen, endometriosis. Who says large language models are useless?
I mean, I think we've just found the real reason why OpenAI exists.
For these kinds of emergencies, pineapple emergencies.
I'm sure when Sam Altman is sitting down in the boardroom, this is one of their biggest achievements. So yeah, Molly, let's get down to business and let's talk about Revela. For those listeners that haven't come across yourself or Revela before, would you be able to give us a brief summary of the company and what it is that you're up to at the moment?
Absolutely. Revela are a women's health tech company, and our primary goal is to improve the pathway to diagnosis for patients with symptoms that could be endometriosis. And the way that we do that is using data, and data that a lot of patients already have collected as part of their journey. So endometriosis is a condition that affects 10% of women. It's incredibly common, and it has lots of very debilitating sometimes, but sometimes really quite non-specific symptoms that are very, very difficult for clinicians to diagnose. And one of the things that patients would normally have as part of their diagnostic journey, and usually quite early on as well, is an ultrasound scan. So what we're doing at Revela is we are taking those ultrasound scans and performing kind of an enhanced analysis, which helps identify signs of endometriosis that can then be delivered back to the clinician and help them to make a more informed decision and help that patient get appropriate care and treatment faster.
I mean, that sounds like a much better use of AI than Claudia's beetroot. I know that there is quite a bit of a spotlight on endometriosis at the moment, but I think for some of our listeners that may not be too familiar about endometriosis, it'd be quite helpful for us to maybe talk a little bit more about that symptom burden that you were just alluding to, and kind of how it may present and some of the impacts that it has.
Yeah, so I think there has been a gap in our knowledge around a lot of women's health conditions. And we are kind of learning more and more that endometriosis is a chronic systemic inflammatory condition, not just a gynecological problem. But on a kind of a basic cellular level, endometriosis is where the cells that are similar to the endometrial lining that would normally be within the womb go outside of the womb. And it can be anywhere, but it is very, very common within the pelvis. And this kind of the symptoms that endometriosis can cause can be absolutely debilitating pain, unable to move sort of pain, but it can also be things like severe fatigue, can cause bowel issues, constipation, diarrhea, and it can affect fertility, leaving lots of women either with issues conceiving and other problems, difficulty going to the bathroom, going for a wee. These symptoms are so broad. They can span so many different conditions, which I think contributes to that real difficulty for lots of women in gaining a timely diagnosis.
Yeah, and I remember reading that it's something like up to 8 years to get a diagnosis. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so the average is 8 years. So for some people that could be 15, for some people that could be 2. And the kind of contributing factors for that time to diagnosis really sit with there's kind of 2 phases. There's the before a patient even sees a doctor, and then there's the time within the healthcare system. And the average time for a patient to actually present with symptoms to their GP is over 3 years. And I think that very much stems from lots of women not necessarily realizing their symptoms aren't normal or something that they're expected to just deal with. So that's kind of starts that diagnostic delay. And there's often kind of like a trigger event where, a woman may have been suffering for a long time, and maybe it's got to a point where they are in absolutely constant pain, or they've read something that makes them realize, oh, maybe something here isn't normal, or they've got a friend that says to them, oh, I really think that what you're experiencing should be looked into. And those kind of trigger events are then what normally results in a patient going to see their GP. When you then look at kind of the time within the healthcare service, nearly half of patients who get an endometriosis diagnosis will have over 10 GP appointments before they get a referral. And when you look at kind of those non-specific symptoms we're talking about, 25% of patients will have a prior incorrect diagnosis before they get their endometriosis diagnosis, with 47% of them having a diagnosis for IBS. So all of these things contribute. And even for a patient who maybe gets a gynecology referral, you then have a delay because there's a 18-month waiting list for someone to get a secondary care appointment within gynecology. So all of these contribute. And then again, if a patient, what I haven't mentioned is that lots of patients end up having an exploratory surgery, a laparoscopy, in order to get their diagnosis. And if they require a laparoscopy to reach their diagnosis, then there'll be another year-long wait to have the surgery to then find out whether they do or don't have endometriosis. And obviously with that, there's also recovery, the hospital time. There's lots and lots of things that just make that journey incredibly difficult for women.
Yeah, I think it's really shocking, isn't it, to think that somebody is going 10 times to their GP with the same symptoms. And I think that, as you were saying, often women don't present until a threshold has been met anyway. I think sometimes people minimize their symptoms. And as you say, sometimes people aren't sure what is a normal period, what should a normal cycle feel like. And I think part of that is because there still is this taboo about us discussing these things openly. As you've alluded to, this 8-year figure does seem to be more in the media now. Was that a driver for you developing Revela? Did you see a gap in the market, or was there something else that took you down that path to work on this?
Yeah, no. So for me, it was a real kind of combination of factors. So I have a very close family member who has not even a diagnosis, but a very strongly suspected endometriosis. She hasn't gone to have a surgery, so she doesn't know for sure. But that was certainly a significant trigger for me, was her experience. You mentioned sort of the stigma around it. She was saying how her symptoms and pain she thought was normal for years and years and years. And only when it got to the point where, it was having a major, major impact on her life, did she realize that something was wrong, and actually only approached a doctor after having heard somebody else give their story about endometriosis and had that kind of trigger moment, that click where maybe that's me. So that was a significant part of it. But I've spent most of my career working in diagnostic technologies. So I think that's the kind of the other part of that inspiration. Revela has been co-founded by myself and also another engineer, Tom Wilshire, who's absolutely brilliant. We had been kind of talking about the value of data in diagnostics and how there are quite a lot of companies and they're doing brilliant things, but who are, developing automatic tests for looking for biomarkers that might indicate different conditions. And we felt that there was a bit of a gap in not looking at all of the data that we already collect and seeing how we can get a ton more value out of it, but then that kind of delivers a very accessible product, something that is easy to roll out, that doesn't change the way that health systems work fundamentally, because that's something that's really difficult to do and requires so much evidence, but bring tools that are kind of add-ons to existing pathways that really help deliver impact as fast as possible. So yeah, Tom and I had been talking about these kind of ideas, and one day I realized that I felt that this journey for endometriosis was something that was so important and such a big problem. And I took it to Tom a little bit nervous in a way, because it's very women's health. And we talked through the impact and like how many people it affected and everything. And Tom absolutely was 100% in from that moment. And we've run with it ever since and not looked back. So yeah, that's the story of how it began.
It's very cool. Can I be a bit ragey about women's pain? So, you know how we said about taboo, and we said about women reaching their own, what their threshold is before they go and see someone. I also believe that there's like a societal threshold for women's pain that is imposed on everyone, because I don't know how many times you've all heard this, but I've heard many times to be told, well, nothing compares to pushing out a baby. Nothing compares to labor. And it's almost like every single pain is nothing, because ultimately you're here for labor. So any pain you have is just not, it's not a big deal. Come on, So there is, I think, this societal expectation that women are supposed to feel pain, supposed to have really high pain thresholds. And I think as a result, we grow up that way and we think, well, period, pain is nothing, because everyone tells me labor is so terrible. This is nothing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of women take that societal pressure seriously, to the point where they don't access the help that they need. I've heard stories of women who have taken themselves almost to like a very severe ill health with appendicitis, because they're used to such pain with their cycle that they didn't realize that something really serious was happening. And I think it's a big problem.
And coil insertion is another one that always springs to mind for me, and how uncomfortable and painful that can be, and how, of course you don't have pain relief for a coil insertion. I was like, why? Hang on a minute.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of societal normalization at play here when it comes to female pain.
Definitely. I think there is, I think Nurofen and their See My Pain campaign is fantastic, because it really does highlight the gender pain gap. And we know, like you were saying, if women don't go when their symptoms are more of a manageable stage, then they will present acutely in hospital, particularly with kind of endometriosis. We know it invades, surrounding structures, and it can have severe impacts, particularly kind of stage 3, stage 4 endometriosis, like you mentioned about fertility, adhesions, input is earlier, then the longer term impacts are less as well. So we know that these delays are causing more chronic problems as well. So, and also I think the evidence shows as well that we typically don't prescribe women as much pain relief as well. So even when they do go and someone's acknowledging their pain, we're not necessarily adequately managing their pain, particularly in endometriosis. I think it's a really important kind of area to address.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of on that pain front, you do have women who are presenting to their GPs in incredible pain, and they are offered painkillers, but without answers. And I think that is, codeine is not like a solution if you don't understand what the root cause is. So I think there's a lot to be done there to make sure that women aren't just take this pill, you'll be fine. And we do have that looking into why they're in such pain. And I think mentally, the ramifications of being in pain and not understanding why are really quite severe as well, and that it's important mentally to have answers.
Yeah, especially because 10% is not a tiny number. 1 in 10 people is not a tiny number. So yeah, I totally agree. Could you tell us then, so in the pathway to diagnosis of endometriosis, where does Revela normally feature?
Yeah, so the technology we're building basically fits into kind of 2 areas of a typical healthcare pathway. So because we're working with ultrasound scans, and lots of patients who are presenting at primary care will be referred for an ultrasound scan, but the scans that are taken there are probably performed by a fairly generalist sonographer. When you approach secondary care and get referred to, say, gynecology, the likelihood is you will also have an ultrasound scan, and that ultrasound scan may be performed by somebody who is more specialist in gynecology. And if you're very lucky, you may even have some specialism in endometriosis.
Sorry, Molly, can I clarify? So this ultrasound, this first ultrasound, is not an ultrasound to look for endometriosis. It's an ultrasound to generally look for why do you have pelvic pain, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So that first ultrasound, the sonographer is typically looking for anything that they can see clearly, fibroids that might be quite obvious, cysts that might be quite obvious, or signs of cancer. So that would be big red flag. And they're looking for those big red flag things. And they're not necessarily trained to look for subtle manifestations of endometriosis.
And
so yeah,
sorry,
so
I'm going to interrupt with
no,
one more
go for it.
question, but are you talking about transvaginal ultrasounds or abdominal ultrasounds? So the internal, the external, or both?
The scans that we receive typically are both. So normally the sonographer starts off with a transabdominal, kind of orient themselves a little with that, and then go on to the transvaginal scan. The transvaginal scans are much better resolution, and the standard that we need to be confident that we're doing a good job with that technology. But yeah, so the way that Revela would fit in would be taking those scans either that are captured in that primary care or the secondary care setting and providing that enhanced analysis on top of that. The difference is the value that Revela brings in those settings. So for a patient that is having their scan in primary care, the goal is to really improve that sensitivity of that primary care scan to help more patients get that early diagnosis. The way that we are designing this technology, you have the sensitivity of a scan, which is basically how many positive cases you're successfully picking up, and specificity, which in simple terms, if you're very specific, you have very few false positives. So we are targeting technology that would be incredibly specific because we don't want to be giving patients a false positive result and may take a small hit on sensitivity to be incredibly specific. But that boost on sensitivity from a kind of a machine learning algorithm versus a typical sonographer is still significant and would allow a lot more patients to get that early diagnosis. When it comes to the secondary care setting, that's where we would see a kind of a greater boost in sensitivity based on the imaging that's being captured. And there is still value there in speeding up that diagnostic journey for the patients, but there's additional value in, so lots of these patients will go on to have a surgery, whether that surgery is to give a patient a final diagnosis or to help them with treatment. So lots of patients will have their endometriosis removed as part of their treatment, which is done with a surgery. Depending on exactly where that endometriosis is and how it's presented will kind of affect which clinicians need to be in the room to perform that surgery. So if you have endometriosis that is all on the ovaries, for example, gynecologist would be the appropriate surgeon to have in the room. But if it's on the bladder, or on the bowel, you might need a colorectal surgeon or a urologist. Having more data to support that surgical planning also has a lot of value, because a patient does not want to have more surgeries than is required. And if they go in for surgery, the gynecologist is there and they find something on the bowel, but there's no colorectal surgeon available, they get sewn back up and then have to go in for another surgery. And there's obviously the recovery time, the resources, kind of everything. It just results in a really non-ideal situation for that patient. And so yes, we really see Revela's technology as having place in multiple places across that pathway, and bringing different value to those places.
The gold standard for diagnosing endometriosis is a diagnostic laparoscopy. For some patients, they may have a pelvic MRI, but there are huge waiting lists for MRI scans in general. So there's still a bottleneck there. So do you see something like MRI is a potential kind of second option? Or for example, if the scan results are inconclusive or you can't confirm?
So I think you kind of hit a point which I haven't mentioned, and that is that we are designing Revela's technology to help more patients get an early diagnosis, but never to rule it out and never to prevent somebody from progressing with an alternative care route. And I think part of the goal of Revela is not obviously use the technology to help those patients get that diagnosis, but also to help with the awareness that if that ultrasound scan has not found something, that does not mean that is the end of the road, and the patient should then get the referral, the follow-up investigations. When it comes to the MRIs themselves, I guess the fundamental algorithms we're building, we could use MRI data to train them and use the same principles to improve the sensitivity of MRI for endometriosis. I think for us, like, in many ways, that would be an easier challenge just because they're more consistent imaging. You get every slice, which is absolutely brilliant, but it's really to do with that accessibility. Like you said, there's long wait lists, and I think it certainly within the NHS, it differs significantly trust to trust. So some trusts will place almost all their patients that are on an endometriosis pathway and give them an MRI, but that tends to be really late on in their journey as well. And in other trusts, they say, there's no availability of MRI, they just use ultrasound or almost exclusively use ultrasound. So I think that the kind of impact will depend on the location and what their methods are, but very few patients are getting an MRI unless that they have already been on quite a journey to get to that point, certainly within the NHS anyway. So I think that focus on ultrasound, which is a very accessible imaging technique and that most patients will have really quite early, that's kind of why we're focused on that area.
Yeah, makes sense. So from ultrasound, you can see, I guess, specific clues that make it possible that this person has endometriosis. And is the AI able to see things that the human eye can't see, or is it able to pick up patterns that the human eye hasn't? Why is AI being so good for this?
Yeah, so the way we kind of build our models is we don't just use ultrasound images that have been annotated by a sonographer who may or may not be very good at identifying endometriosis. We take ultrasound scans from patients who've gone on to have an exploratory laparoscopy and where those surgical findings are known. So we know that they had, for example, endometriosis on the bladder, and we know how that presented and where that was. And what we do is we use those surgical findings alongside the ultrasound scans from each patient to bring that kind of ground truth data without having to rely on that almost like that radiological analysis that may or may not be correct. So that's how we build models that can be very sensitive and can identify those patterns that the human eye might struggle to.
I think that's really interesting as well, Molly, because my understanding is that with endometriosis, the symptom burden doesn't always correlate with the disease that we actually find on laparoscopy. So someone may have quite a high symptom burden and be really struggling, and we may find a lower grading or staging on the laparoscopy. Or they can sometimes have quite severe endometriosis, but those symptoms may not seem to have as much of an impact. With that in mind, do you look at kind of any ultrasounds just from controls, just to compare kind of, are we potentially missing disease? Is there kind of research, or is that being considered?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting one of the almost reasons that we are able to build these models using the ultrasound and the laparoscopic data is almost because that symptom burden is different from patient to patient, which means that you can have patients that are presenting for a laparoscopy who might have minimal presentation of disease, which means that you kind of were able to get that spectrum, even though patients are that I guess the patients that we're using to train our technology kind of typically further through that diagnostic process. But because there is such a spectrum, that allows us to get like a reasonable cross section of the kind of patient population. So yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's,
what
that
do the
answers the question.
patients? Sorry, I mean, what do the patients think when you've spoken to them about this technology?
Yeah, so I think I guess we've spoken to quite a lot of patients who have ended up with the diagnosis of endometriosis and have been through a difficult journey to get there.
Shall we have a quick listen to an endometriosis patient's perspective?
I think Revela could make a life-changing impact for both patients and clinicians when it comes to the detection and diagnosis of endometriosis. The current journey to getting a diagnosis it's such a minefield, and from a patient perspective, it can be really traumatic, particularly with the amount of time and tests and questioning that's involved. And for so many people suffering, they just want to be heard and believed. And Revela is offering that chance at cutting out those really invasive diagnostic options, so we're not having to put our body through surgery just to be able to say we finally know what's causing us so much pain and trauma, and to be believed. And even from a clinician side, it's fantastic. It means that an already very strained NHS is being provided with more diagnostic tools, and it's given doctors and patients a clearer idea of what they're dealing with at an earlier stage in the treatment process. And from a patient perspective, having already gone through that surgical diagnostic and treatment route, having the ability for a scan to be able to pick up on something I already knew was wrong but had a battle to be believed would be absolutely priceless.
So the general appetite for technology supporting them in a faster diagnosis is really, there is a great appetite for it. I think like there's some kind of critical points that patients want to know, and that is that there isn't a computer that's taken over. There's a computer isn't just making all the decisions for them without clinicians being involved and kind of understanding what they're going through. And our goal for this technology is actually not to be a diagnostic tool. It is to be a clinical decision support tool. It's to provide extra information, helping those clinicians make that decision, but it's definitely not trying to take over. And I think the other thing is what they don't want is technology like Revela to tell them everything's okay and have a doctor say, oh, this technology says you're okay. Of course you're okay, even though they're experiencing symptoms. And again, that really comes down to the way that we communicate those reports and making sure that we are not influencing clinicians in the wrong direction to say things are okay when they're not. And I think there's awareness that can come with our reporting that helps clinicians almost realize that just because nothing's been found here doesn't mean that nothing exists and that further investigation is required.
And how have you found it, Molly, kind of moving into the women's health space? Have you worked in the women's health sector previously?
Sort of, so I had worked on development of a test for HPV before, which has women's health applications, but again, I wasn't in such I guess like a more community facing position as I am now. And I love working in the women's health space. And a part of this comes from the fact that it's been neglected for far, far, far too long. And there are so many data gaps that we need to fill. But that does mean that it's a very exciting space to be in, that there is so much to learn. There is so many places that we can make improvements, and that it comes at an interesting time with where we are in development of technologies like AI, and how I think we can move faster now than maybe we could have done 20 years ago. So yeah, no, I'm enjoying working in the women's health space. I think it's sometimes scary and a little bit disheartening when you realize how little has been done for so long, but I think it's a great space to be in to make a difference when we really need it.
That's nice. And what advice would you give to other women that are hoping to turn a women's health problem into a tech solution?
I think that it's really important to make sure that you understand your problem incredibly well. And I think that means talking to patients, talking to clinicians, and finding out the thing that you're trying to solve, does it really exist? And is there an appetite to change it? Because I think that if you're trying to solve something where nobody's motivated enough, that would be a difficult problem to crack. And I think that's one of the things about Revela's focus on endometriosis is there are so many women who have suffered for such a long time that there is a huge motivation, both from clinicians and for patients, to really improve that space. And we've had such a lot of kind of great feedback on what we're doing and where it fits into clinical pathways that I would advise anybody else on that path to try and do the same, try and really test that early on before they get in too deep.
And do you find it's super hard to focus? Like, because I imagine you've got all this data, you've got all these ultrasounds, you could get into diagnosing all sorts of things. So is it very specific to you that you've wanted to narrow down on endometriosis, or are you thinking actually that you're going to expand to other conditions too?
Our first focus is endometriosis, and the reason for that is because it's such a significant problem. It affects so many people and has been such a struggle for such a long time. But like you say, we could do a lot more. And I think that's where we see the future of Revela is going beyond endometriosis. But I think we need to start where there's such a high demand and where we can make great impact, do a really good job, and then work on expanding our technology beyond endometriosis.
Yeah.
And other than Revela, Molly, are there any other emerging health techs or founders that you've come across that are working in the endometriosis space that have inspired you or that you think are ones to watch?
Yeah, so there's a lady called Jenna who runs, I think it's called My Endy app. And that is a mobile application that is just brilliant for patients who are trying to get to grips with their symptoms, keep a log, help them communicate that with their GP or their doctor, keep track of what medications they're on, when their appointments are. And it's just a really good tool that is accessible. People can just download and start to benefit from the technologies that are out there.
Yeah, I think symptom trackers are always really helpful, particularly in a condition where there's a long wait list and you're having repeat appointments with your GP. I personally think that they're really useful because it helps you come up with a strategy together, as to what's working and what isn't working.
I think we'll see more and more coming through as well. I think there'll be more exciting things to come.
Yeah, for sure. So where can our listeners learn more about Revela, Molly, and where can they find out more about you?
So they can find us online. Our website is www.revela.health. We have a fresh Instagram account with very little on it at the moment, but we'll be sharing more soon. And that is revela.health as well. And on LinkedIn, just search for Revela Health.
Perfect.
Amazing. Well, if you want any inspiration about fruit and veg,
that's what I was going to say. I think we share a brain, Emma, because I was like, I've got an excellent idea for you, Molly, for your first Instagram post.
Claudia will send you a beetroot from Cyprus in the
Brilliant. I look forward to it.
I think that's quite a hardy vegetable to send to courier across Europe. I don't think the pineapple would fare as well.
Be cheaper than a pineapple.
Yeah,
that too.
A bit lighter.
Oh, thank you so much, Molly. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us and letting us know everything about Revela. And we'll head over to that Instagram page.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk about Revela and to have a lovely chat with you.
Thank you. Well, best of luck, Molly. See you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for being here. We love having you with us on this journey through women's health and innovation.
Follow us on Instagram at the Pink Pineapple Podcast for clips, conversations, and the latest in women's health and femtech.
We'll see you next week. Same pineapple, new topic. Everything we talk about on the Pink Pineapple Podcast is here to inform and inspire, but it's not a substitute for professional medical advice. If you're worried about your health, please reach out to your GP or healthcare provider.